Hello YouTube, this is Goddard Radio Moscow here again with another beer review. Now as promised, albeit with a one video delay, I'm going to return to Australia and give you another Australian beer review. So today I have Crown Lager, which comes to you from Melbourne in the state of Victoria in Eastern Australia. Now on the note of Australia, I'd also like to give a shout out to Tiny from OffTapBrewing, who's been commenting on various videos of mine, but he has some very interesting videos on home brewing and stuff like that, so I'll put his link the link to his channel in the description of this video, so please check his stuff out. He seems to have a house just full of various contraptions that he's put together for home brewing. Some really interesting videos there, so please check them out. But as is usual with my videos, I'll just take you through a history of the Crown Lager, and this one has a really kind of random history. I've never heard of one that has quite the history of this one, I would say. But if you are simply interested in the tasting of this beer, then feel free, just fast forward towards the last few minutes of the video where you'll catch that. But this beer was originally brewed by Carlton and United Breweries, or Cub Brewery, who are based in Abbotsford, one of the suburbs in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Now in 1983, Cub became a subsidiary of Elders IXL and was then delisted. And in 1990, Elders IXL became known as the Foster's Group, and in 2004, Cub then changed their name to Carlton and United Beverages. Now Foster's Group was actually bought over by South African brewer S.A.B. Miller, who you'll no doubt have heard of, one of the biggest breweries in the world, and they were bought over by them in December 2011, and the Carlton and United were also acquired as part of this deal. Now, as I said, this beer has a very kind of random history, and there's actually a lot of uncertainty about it. I have an article that I read on this beer that I'll put the link for in the description. It's from Brew News Australia, so hopefully it's quite reliable. But there is actually, as I say, there's a certain amount of uncertainty regarding the history of this beer. Now the official brand history in the Cub media release stated that the beer was first created in 1919 but was only brewed in limited amounts and reserved exclusively for visiting diplomats and Australian ambassadors before being made available to the Australian public in 1954 during Queen Elizabeth II's inaugural visit to Australia after she had ascended to the throne in 1952 and then been coronated in 1953, although oddly this article actually talks about the Queen's coronation being in 1952, although that was when she ascended to the throne, but her official coronation service was 1953. I'm not sure how exactly it works with the monarchs, whether their reign is from their official coronation or when it's the ascent to the throne. I'm not a great fan of the royals personally, but I'm not so bothered. But anyway, you know that now. But anyway, many of the people have obviously questioned this particular history of the beer, both in terms of the commercial feasibility and the actions indeed of the Australian government. They're questioning whether the Australian government would actually go to the trouble of sanctioning a beer in this manner, which many doubt they would. But there is actually the question of whether this beer was released in 1952 when the Queen ascended to the throne, or in 1954 when she first made the visit to Australia. And there's also a speech in 2003 from the then boss of Foster's, Ted Kunkel, who said that the beer was launched in 1953 and that in 2003 they would actually be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the beer, and that would obviously coincide with the Queen's coronation service in 1953. So there's also actually been adverts found that show a Foster's Crown Lager advertised in newspapers before 1954 in various parts of Australia, and these include, the years of this include 1914, but they obviously say it was started in 1919. There's one in 1920, and even Victorian Government Gazette had an advert for it in 1949, which indicates that it was available to the public before 1954 when they're saying it was available. So to summarise, it appears, as I say, this is a very weird history of this beer. The history of the beer goes like this. We have a publicly advertised beer in 1914 that the company say it wasn't commissioned until 1919, but was then launched to the public to apparently celebrate both the Queen's ascension to the throne in 1952, or the coronation as that article I was talking about seems to call it, and the inaugural Australian visit of the Queen in 1954, with the head of Foster's actually saying that the 50th anniversary of this beer was celebrated in in 2003, indicating a 1953 launch. So there's a very, very confusing history as to when this beer actually came about. Now, the author of this Brew News Australia article that I read, he said that he had it checked out by their resident historian, Dr. Brett Stubbs, and he seems to think that the beer was actually released in 1952, and indeed the label of the beer in the 1950s celebrated the coronation of the Queen, which would coincide with what they're saying in 1952. But like I say, the Queen wasn't officially coronated until 1953. She ascended to the throne in 1952. So I assume this is what they're meaning when they say coronation. But he also stated that German beer imports to Australia stopped with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And so Australia began to produce large quantities of lager, which it hadn't done before. And Cub actually launched Foster's lager beer in 1914 in Victoria, possibly to replace the German import that was called Crown Lager beer, and they think that that might actually be where the name of this beer has come from. And interestingly, there was apparently a counterfeiting activity within the British colonies during the First World War, as German beer was very, very popular amongst the colonials. Now, although Dr. Stubbs has written books about the anti-German hysteria that gripped Australia when war broke out, and apparently Cub cut the production of their Bismarck, Rheingold and Strasbourg beers due to their Germanic names, and the hysteria in Australia, the anti-German hysteria, was so bad that apparently Edmund Resch, a prominent brewer within Sydney, was actually interned in 1917. But he had moved to Australia from Bavaria in 1863, and he'd become a citizen of Australia in 1889, and his younger brother Emil had emigrated before him in 1881, and at this particular time he was the general manager of Carlton and United Breweries, and he resigned in 1914 on the outbreak of war. So basically, this doctor seems to think that the name Crown Lager came from the fact that the Australians had replaced the German imported beers with their own home-brewed lagers, obviously. But as far as he could gather, Crown Lager continued to be produced after the war and was repopularised in the 1950s for the Royal Tour, although he couldn't say when the transition from being Foster's Crown Lager to being taken under the wing of Carlton or Cub occurred. He couldn't say exactly when it stopped being Foster's Crown Lager and became Cub Crown Lager, basically. But there are various mentions of various different Crown Lagers before 1914, but the history apparently, according to Dr. Stubbs, points to the fact that these beers were all imports, and it's possibly the intention of using the Crown Lager name was actually to capture the market from the fact that these German beers were no longer being imported, you know, trading with the enemy and all this. But as I said, it's been impossible to actually fully determine the origin of this beer, but it's known that the beer was available as far afield as Cairns in northern Queensland and Perth in Western Australia, the completely other side of the country, and was available actually 5 years prior to the 1919 date officially stated, which is actually on the bottle here. I'll let you have a closer look at that in a second. But apparently nobody has been granted access to the brewery's official archives, although it has been reported that Carlton or Cub will reinvestigate the origins of this beer. So it seems to be, it could possibly be that there is a bit of false advertising on here to give the brewery a bit of you know, a sort of colourful history, if you like, but nobody knows. As I say, they've not been able to access the brewery's own archives. But anyway, let's get on with the tasting of this beer. I hope you found that interesting and not just me rambling. I'll let you have a little look at this, at the bottle of this one. Let me just bring the camera up here. So as you can see, it has the Crown Lager on it. There's some nice kind of glass work in there. You can see the Crown symbol on here. And it says on the bottle, recognised as Australia's finest premium lager since it was first commissioned to honour visiting dignitaries in 1919. So they're still saying that it's 1919 on here, although it appears to be that the date was, that a Crown Lager was available in Australia in 1914. So hopefully we'll get a clear indication of that. But next year, 2014, will actually be the 100th anniversary of the Foster's Lager, so that'll be quite interesting. Maybe they'll release some data about this beer when that, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Foster's Lager. For those of you interested in the bottle cap, as you can see, it just has the same symbol that's on the label here, obviously. But anyway, without further ado, let's get this guy opened up. Oh, and incidentally, another note on the bottle actually is apparently this bottle was designed by Evelyn Annie Harvey, who was a commercial artist in Melbourne, but was actually known for drawing some critical and highly secretive maps for General Douglas MacArthur during World War II. So the bottle indeed has an interesting history behind it as well, and apparently that is true. There's no real debate about the fact that this woman designed the bottle. But this one, we'll get them open and get them tasted. But this is a 4.9% pale lager. It is, apparently they say that they have exclusive, exclusively selected malt, barley and hops for this beer, and apparently it's 100% Australian hops and things like that are used in it, so it's a completely home brew, this one. Try and give this a bit of an aggressive pour, get some head on it here. Seems to be quite a fluffy head, by the way. I'll just turn that bottle back around there. But yeah, it seems to be quite a fluffy head, bit of big bubbles in it. It's a completely kind of clear pale golden lager. There's very few bubbles visible in this one at all. It actually maybe seems to have a little bit of a haze to it. I'm not just sure if that's condensation on my glass or not. But anyway, let's give them a smell. Now yeah, apparently it's actually a bit stronger smell than you get from various kind of macro brewed lagers. I'm sure this one isn't particularly a craft beer, it's more of a mass produced thing. But yeah, this is it's a bit stronger than normal for a macro lager. It's what I'm getting off of it here is the usual kind of light malts that you would expect from a lager. There's a bit of corn sweetness, I would say, and you are getting some grains, and there is that bready and yeasty element to it. Like I say, it's got a bit of a kind of stronger smell to it than a usual sort of mass-produced lager, which is obviously good. Hopefully it's got a good bit of taste in it, and it'll be interesting for the fact that it's 100% Australian hops, barley and yeast and things that go into this one. So this is a completely Australian beer. Now let's give this guy a taste and see what he's like. That's quite interesting, I have to say. It's quite similar to the smell. This is a very, very kind of light beer. I'm getting a lot of sort of sweetness off it, I would say. There's the sweet, the breadiness seems to be quite sweet in this one, I would say. And there are the kind of corny notes in it as well that are quite sweet also. It really is just a very, very kind of sweet lager. There's not really so much bitterness to this at all, and it doesn't have a dry feel to it either, I would say. Just a very, very kind of corny sweet and a very sort of bready and yeasty lager. It's very light. In terms of the mouth, it's a very, very light beer, a wet kind of mouth feel. It's really quite crisp and refreshing actually. There's not much carbonation to it at all. It's very, very smooth. It's quite unique for that fact actually. I've seen this one apparently, I looked it up before and it got quite bad reviews, but this is actually quite a nice sort of sweet corny bready lager. I have to say this is actually really quite a nice beer in my opinion, I would say. I'm not sure why it's got quite so bad reviews. It's probably just, you know, looking at Beer Advocate and Rate Beer and things, and people are obviously more used to the craft beer. But I mean, in terms of the style of beer that it is, obviously a macro produced lager, it's got a nice sweet taste to it. I mean, in terms of if you're just out and wanting a quick beer, you know, this is probably a good thing for you to pick up. It's really light, ideal for a summer's day. You expect Australian beers to be very light because obviously it's a very, very hot country. It tends to be the trend that you'll get beers that are very, very light there. But I would say, in terms of the style, it's quite nice. It does have quite a bland flavour though, I would say. It has that sort of corny and bready sweetness to it. But the thing is, it's unique in terms of being a 100% Australian product beer. So it's interesting to try in that regard. I'm not sure exactly what the availability of this one is in the UK or abroad. I got this one off the internet and I think I was maybe quite lucky to pick it up there. But if you get the chance, give it a try. I mean, if you want a very light beer for a very hot day, this is a good one to go for. It doesn't really have any bitterness to it, it's just a sort of nice mild sweet feel. It's got a very kind of wet mouth feel to it, which is obviously makes it very, very refreshing, so it's good in that regard. And I would say, you know, always don't knock a beer before you've tried it, always give it a try, and I would say there is potential to enjoy this one, but as I've said before, beer is subjective, it's really down to your own preferences. But anyway, I hope that this beer review has been quite informative for you. Hopefully you've not just found me rambling about the history, and hopefully I didn't confuse you with this particular history, but reading about it, it actually did kind of confuse me a little bit. But anyway, thanks again for watching. As I say, I hope it's been informative, and please let me know your own thoughts on this particular beer. As I say, beer is subjective. You might like it, I might not, vice versa, all of this kind of thing. I think it's quite nice for the style, to be honest. But please, as usual, like, share, subscribe, comment, all the usual YouTube things. You've been watching Goddard Radio Moscow, and I'll be back soon with another beer review. Cheers.